Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host, and on this episode, I'm thrilled to have Ben Brown on the show. He is an NFL data scientist, he is a football analytics expert, and he is a contributor to Pinnacle Sportsbook. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ed. Yeah, thanks for having me. I know it's been, about a year since we got to connect through this podcast, but it's always a pleasure, being able to kind of talk about not only, the weekly upcoming, matchups and things that we have from NFL and NCAA, but also just some, bigger picture type things from an football analytics perspective. So I definitely love listening to your podcast, and I definitely enjoy any opportunity I get to, kind of go back and forth with you on some of these interesting insights we have into both the NFL and college football game.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your coming on. I was looking back at it, and you came on exactly this week a year ago, the week of college football championship week. And, there's a reason that you come on this week, because you are one of the few quantitative people that can talk with equal expertise on both college football and the NFL. So I'm really pumped to have you on again.
Yeah, I remember. It seems like in a lot of ways we were talking about the same things. I think we got, some Georgia, Alabama discussion in last year. I think we're, probably set up a little bit to talk about that again. But yeah, it's, I do think there is, obviously something to, and I know it's something that you do, but like focusing on a specific conference or even like, subset of college football games, because you do understand it so much better. And I think in some ways, I have gravitated to that, but I still have, some understanding of the higher end games, the Georgia, Alabamas of the world and those sorts of things. And I think, being able to handicap a lot of those things is something I've tried to buy into with my approach and kind of build up my betting approach to be able to handicap a lot of those diversified outcomes, I would say.
Excellent. Yeah. And you also called that Kansas State would beat TCU as well. So
that's right.
That was pretty awesome.
That's
this
right.
podcast is brought to you by Power Rank Sports Betting Newsletter. Looking for some action any given weekend? This is the free service for you. As 5 Nugget Saturday is my curated list of tips in analytics. To sign up for free, go to thepowerrank.com. Ben, is there a football bet for this weekend that you would be willing to share your process on?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I'll probably focus on the NFL with this one, and I'm hoping that, listeners will be able to listen to this before Sunday. Obviously they will. But to me, I think the marquee matchup, 49ers, Eagles, obviously both are kind of sitting in the top of the NFC Championship odds, Super Bowl odds, at Pinnacle, at basically any other sportsbook, FanDuel as well. But based on my numbers and what I've kind of looked at just from a power ratings perspective, I do feel like the Eagles are, in a lot of ways, the better team. I do think it was a really impressive win, with what they had against the Bills coming from behind once again. And it does seem like, at least from where they were at in 2022 to what they've shown in 2023, I do think the Eagles have maybe in some ways been underwhelming on a per game basis. But I think the spot where they've dominated is in some of these, come from behind type situations. They lead the league in EPA generated when they are trailing in games. And I think overall, like that was maybe the discussion point or question that we had for the Eagles last year is, they're so dominant up front and in the trenches. Like, can they beat a team that's on the same playing level as them, especially if they do need to come from behind? And I think in a lot of ways, especially this season, they have kind of answered that question. So I think overall, even though there were some hiccups and I would say struggles moving on from both their offensive and defensive coordinator, I think they've kind of figured it out. And I think Jalen Hurts is in a lot of ways playing better than where they were at last year. And I think offensively, they're kind of starting to hit their stride in a lot of ways. So the Eagles at +3, I think is a weird spot. In some ways, I thought the market was going to correct a little bit too much for the 49ers on their kind of 3-game stretch. And obviously they've kind of come out from that a little bit, but this is still the same Brock Purdy led team that, he's leading the league in EPA generated offensively. I think if you remove turnovers from that EPA play set, like he has like a 0.45 EPA per play, which is, ungodly good and is so much better than the second best player. But it's still a question of like, what are you going to get from him from a turnover perspective? I think according to Fantasy Network's charting data, he's at like a 3.4% interception worthy type play, which is, in a lot of ways lower than what I would have even expected it to be. There's obviously some fumble variance as well that's kind of tied into that 3-game losing streak stretch. But I think overall you're getting you're getting a 3 on a key number with the better quarterback in this matchup. And to me, I don't think that the skill position players for the 49ers is all that great of a differentiator than what the Eagles have. Obviously Dallas Goedert's not going to be playing, and I think that might be the one key thing that the 49ers can potentially hinge their outlook on. But I think at the number that we're seeing right now, I know it is a pretty decent juice spot, but I do think the Eagles +3 at like -119, -120 is probably my favorite NFL bet here. And I do think they're going to probably, if they do still start out slow, I have the confidence in them, given what they've shown in previous games, to, I would say, kind of come from behind and beat a team that's very much on the same playing level as them.
Ben, I absolutely love that you brought up this game. I first heard about the line that San Francisco was favored by 3 on the road at Philly, and I said, sure, of course they're favored by 3, and we'll get into why I think that. And then I ran my numbers on Tuesday morning like I always do for my members, and I actually have Philly favored in this game, which I was surprised at. And the reason why, Ben, is that I don't think Jalen Hurts is great at throwing the football. Their passing offense is about 11th right now. When I look at passing success rate adjusted for opponent, this is the metric that I kind of trust the most. He obviously adds a lot with his legs, but I really want your opinion on where you see Jalen Hurts as a passer. I mean, we've seen some like really kind of meager performances over the last 2 weeks where they've been able to win against Kansas City based on basically some dumb luck drops and so on and so forth. And then they were also able to come back against Buffalo, which is obviously another good team. But where do you view Jalen Hurts as a passer?
I think in a lot of ways it is, it is in some ways a concern, because it does seem, I would say, like, from his perspective, like he does need a guy like AJ Brown to kind of win in some of these contested catch type situations. To me, like, I think that they are still pretty big play dependent in a lot of ways. And I think if you're looking at like his deep passing percentage, like, he's throwing the ball deep, like 13.1% of dropbacks, and has a completion set percentage right around like 40%, where I think if you are, looking from, like a high end player at the quarterback position, especially this season, guys like Tua, guys like Dak Prescott, even, a guy like CJ Stroud, they're all above that 50% threshold. So although he has a similar deep passing percentage, his completion percentage just really isn't there. He's not as accurate as some of those guys, that we've recently mentioned. And I think because of that, in a lot of ways, he does need to offer something with his legs, right? And we have seen that. And I do think there is something to the Eagles maybe moving to a more methodical approach offensively, where they do understand that, 3rd and short is very much going to translate into a first down conversion or a 4th and short situation where they can kind of run, the tush push and continue to generate that at a highly enough effective clip to, I would say, be a successful offense. So I think just intermixing in some of the shots to AJ Brown, allowing him and trusting him to win some of these one-on-one, opportunities, even if it does look like he is, in a lot of ways covered and doesn't necessarily have the same separation as you'd want from a deep throw. I think allowing that to happen and maybe taking a little bit of hit on the completion percentage, because Jalen Hurts might just be a little bit less accurate than a guy like, even Dak Prescott this year, who I do think is kind of playing pretty close to an MVP type level and playing pretty close to, I would say, his ceiling type outcome over his career. Like, I think that's just a thing that you have to take and evaluate and understand. Like, I don't know if Jalen Hurts is ever going to be a top 3 quarterback from a passing perspective, but when you kind of fold in everything else that he can do, and the fact that he does minimize a lot of the high negative variance type plays that can happen from both a sack percentage and a turnover play perspective, I think that's the equation that you need with Jalen Hurts. And I think overall with that, because the passing is a little bit lacking, I think making up for it in other areas is just something that you have to expect from him, and something that he's actually done in a lot of ways. So to me, I think the adjusted EPA based on opponent strength, in some ways from a passing perspective, just isn't going to play all that well to him, because they have in some ways been fortunate to come from behind and win some of these games that we talked about. And I think there's probably 2 sides of that discussion or argument. But to me, I think, you're not wrong in saying that he has, maybe not necessarily struggled, but maybe doesn't have the high end passing performance, but I think that the Eagles have kind of figured it out to the point where they maybe don't necessarily need that from him on a individual play basis in order to, I would say, win some of these matchups against teams that are on, a similar plane to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I like that you brought up CJ Stroud. I do feel like Jalen Hurts has all the resources available to him. AJ Brown's elite. Devontae Smith might be a little bit off, but still an amazing receiver. And then CJ Stroud might just be a unicorn, but he's doing it with Tank Dell and Nico Collins, right?
Right.
But I also want to ask you a little bit about Brock Purdy. I don't know if you have those same numbers about deep passing percentage, but where do you view him as a passer?
Yeah, I know I probably should get hate for this, and I've kind of stuck to my priors maybe even longer than what longer than what I should have with Brock Purdy. But to me, it's a situation where it does seem like he just has so much more opportunities to throw to receivers from a separation standpoint that is a lot easier than what most other quarterbacks are asked of him. And in some ways, it is, yes, the skill position players that the 49ers have, but I do think in a lot of ways, and I know we talk about this all the time, but it is a Kyle Shanahan-led scheme that does maximize the strengths of any individual quarterback and in some ways elevates them from an EPA perspective. And we saw it with Jimmy Garoppolo, and I think in a lot of ways we are still seeing it with Brock Purdy. But for his deep passing numbers, like, he has been really good, and he has been kind of in that upper echelon of elite plays. He doesn't necessarily have the same volume of deep passes. I think he's at like 12.1% of his dropbacks, but 56.8% completion percentage, 91.9% accuracy percentage, which is very much, I would say, I think like the second best mark in football through the 2023 season right now. So he has been really good. The question is, again, like, from a separation standpoint, is he throwing to a lot more wide open receivers? Whereas, Jalen Hurts maybe doesn't have that, luxury play in and play out, because I do think a guy like AJ Brown is thought of as an elite receiver, but in a lot of ways wins in a much different way than a guy like Deebo Samuel does, and even Brandon Ayuk does, right? Like, it does seem like even kind of coming out of college, like AJ Brown was, the one guy that has been really successful in being a contested catch guy that is better than expected in that particular stat. And that is a stat that is really noisy and doesn't translate really well to the NFL level. And the fact that he has been, I would say translated well from that angle it is definitely like an outlier thing. But I also think it's, it's winning in a different way, and it maybe isn't the spot that necessarily elevates the quarterback stats that you're playing with. But it does still kind of have that expectation of being a constant thing for AJ Brown in particular. So I don't know. It's interesting to me because, like, I've always been lower than Brock Purdy. To me, I still think there is, and I mentioned it before, but like his turnover worthy play rate or his interception rate hasn't been as high as where I would have projected it to be coming out of Iowa State, especially in his junior and senior season, where he was, very bad, I would say, taking care of the football. And in some ways that hasn't translated yet. And in some ways, for me, like, the only thing that I can really hang my hat on as far as like why that's the case is because he is in this Kyle Shanahan scheme that very much is minimizing some of the throws that would lead to him needing to kind of make that decision, on what read he's actually throwing to. And he is just really trusting Kyle Shanahan to throw to the guy that he is saying is going to be open on this particular play. So I'm still concerned, especially with Brock Purdy going up against, what I would consider an elite defense. When those sorts of things happen, I do think some of the things that they're doing and having success with is not necessarily going to be there. So I do think this is kind of a key matchup for me in particular in my evaluation of Brock Purdy, because I do think if he performs well, like, some of the things that I've said here and rambled on about aren't necessarily true, but I do think if he does have some of those struggles, like, it is a spot where they are better at punching down, but when they are playing someone on the same level of play as them, that's a spot where I do think the 49ers can easily be, in some ways, shown to maybe not be the class of the NFL like they're being priced at right now.
For sure. So Ben likes Philadelphia +3 at home. Ben, let's move on to college football. We have this great game with Georgia and Alabama. Georgia is 6.5-point favorite. They've been playing pretty well, maybe a little bit of a hiccup against Georgia Tech last week. Alabama needed a flat miracle to beat rival Auburn last week. How do you see this game playing out?
Yes, we mentioned before, the more things change, the more they stay the same. To me, I think, I would say just in general, it does seem like the SEC is obviously down. I do think that's a pretty widely thought of, opinion here in 2023, but this isn't the same Georgia and Alabama that we've seen dominate the past few seasons. I think Georgia's like 13th from an EPA per rush attempt. They are fifth in drop back, EPA per drop back, but Alabama's like not even in the top 25 in either one of these categories. And kind of like you said, needed the 4th and 31 prayer to beat Auburn last week. I know the Iron Bowl is always like highly contested, in a really difficult matchup, but I just don't have a ton of, I would say, belief that this is an Alabama team that is much better than what their kind of underlying metrics are currently pricing in. So I do I would say, agree with the spread. To me, I do think Alabama is going to need to hit on a ton of like high variance type explosive plays, which is kind of what they've needed to live on the entire season, right? I think Jalen Milroe has the highest ADOT in the nation. Carson Beck, one of the lowest ADOTs. And if Milroe can like kind of avoid the heavy sack rate that he's been plagued with kind of this season, maybe that gives Alabama a chance, but I do still think it's going to need to be a couple really explosive plays, Alabama jumping out to an early lead, and I just don't really see, that game script playing out, especially with how well I would say Carson Beck's actually played this season. So I think for me, I don't love anything on the full game spread. If I was going to play something, I do think it would probably be Georgia -3 first half, kind of sitting on that key number right now. I would expect Alabama to probably be playing from behind and maybe need a sort of miracle once again, I would say, to actually emerge victorious. But I just don't see it this year, especially with Alabama. They're a team that, for all intents and purposes, I would say is underwhelmed. And I just don't think they're going to have enough to close the gap against Georgia this year. I'd be interested in hearing kind of where your numbers price this game out at, because I do think it is, appealing for how much, you need to rest on some of your priors and where we were at with both these teams preseason in comparison to kind of what they've shown on the football field here, I would say, in 2023.
Right. My best numbers have Georgia by 3.7 points. So showing value on Alabama. I don't think I love it. I mean, I wouldn't bet Alabama. I do think this Georgia defense is not the same as it has been. Just some astounding numbers from the Georgia Tech game. They allowed Georgia Tech to have a 57.1 rushing success rate. The college football average is about 42%. I think there's some personal misery going on in Kirby Smart. Right. It's really, the offense has been good. Carson Beck's been good. The defense just really hasn't been there. And honestly, like, it really opens up this entire college football playoff.
Right.
That Georgia isn't dominant. So I'm really interested.
It makes it fun for our Michigan Wolverines, I would say, for sure. But I think in a lot of ways, like, the Big 12 is going to be there, the ACC. In some ways has some challengers as well. Obviously, Florida State, the quarterback situation is not great. But I think like this is, and I know we probably say this every year, but this does feel like probably the most wide open college football playoff, of anyone we've seen, I would say, in the last 5 years. So it'll be fun. It'll be fun down the stretch. But to me, I think if I was like just on anybody from a national championship perspective, it definitely feels like this is a Michigan Wolverines year for sure.
You had to bring it up, Ben.
I know. I'm sorry. I knew you were trying to avoid it. I had to just throw it out.
No. I'm not trying to avoid it, because I'm going to tell you what I think is the truth. Michigan won a really tight game against Ohio State, a team that's clearly one of the best teams in the country. They got past the hurdle. Like I said, Georgia's not the same as it was last year. This is the year for Michigan. They're going to win a title. It's going to be this year. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying they're going to do it, but this is the golden opportunity that they have to jump on. They're going to kill Iowa, and they'll be the first or second seed, and they're going to have winnable 50-50 games.
Right. I don't see them as I don't see them as anything more than like a field goal underdog at worst, right? In any matchup, basically, right? So kind of like you said, like a 50-50 game, like obviously things will need to break right from a turnover perspective, but I do think they are probably, in my opinion, the best team entering the college football playoff. And I think that's, it's a very exciting time for Michigan fans. I feel like my loyalty is very much moved into the Big Ten's direction. And I would honestly, for me, I would love to see, the national championship come home, I would say for sure. So we'll see if it happens. I hope we didn't curse it or anything, but I think from my numbers perspectives, I think they are, the best team. And kind of like you said, like this is very much the year in which it needs to happen.
Yep. Ben, so Atlanta is going to go play the New York Jets, who insist on starting Tim Boyle at the quarterback position again. How do you go about making any type of quantitative or not quantitative prediction when you have so little data on a guy like Tim Boyle?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in the Jets direction, it's really bad. But I would say from like a model perspective, especially when you're trying to take into account individual player level metrics, and kind of trying to fold that into a model prediction for the spread or money line or even total, basically. You're kind of required, I would say, to come up with some sort of like replacement level value or average level value for any one individual player, especially at the quarterback position. And I think for the NFL, it's obviously easier to do replacement. For college, I think it's much easier to do average. But I think that's sort of your starting point for evaluating a quarterback with little to no data. And I do think, especially at the NFL level, once you have a player that it's at least reached that level, even if they don't have NFL level data, we should probably have like some type of data from them, whether it be at the college football NCAA level, whether it is, maybe even XFL or USFL data. And you can at least understand, like, based on that scale, where were they at in comparison to kind of some of these other guys, right? And I think that is, maybe the next step of trying to evaluate a guy like Tim Boyle, who doesn't have a ton of reps at the NFL level. And I think, kind of going back and forth on judging him around where this replacement level value that you've kind of already calculated is, and whether he is, slightly above replacement level player, whether he's slightly below replacement level. I think at an NFL level, it is hard to find a guy that's lower than replacement level. It does seem like the Jets in particular are kind of trying to challenge that notion this year. But I think, like there's still there's a barrier to entry of starting an NFL game that, no matter how dire the situation has gotten, these guys are still in some ways capable of at least putting forth this somewhat efficient effort. And I know we shouldn't be judging guys based solely on their lows and trying to figure out, where on this competency level they actually can be at. And I think judging them against, a top 10 unit in the NFL is very much different than, a league average day. But I think on certain days, things come together for players. And although it happens, a lot more with the good ones, the quality quarterbacks, I do think there are backups that can have a quality game in them and kind of evaluate and elevating them at that particular level is probably not the correct thing to do. And also at their absolute lows is not the correct thing to do. And I think, I would say to me, there's a relatively recent good example of this. And it's, my hometown team, the Minnesota Vikings, getting Joshua Dobbs in the fold. And there was a ton of excitement, especially early on with what he could provide. But to me, he's still kind of, he probably is above the replacement level discussion in some ways because they did give up, a certain amount of draft pick to actually get him. But I still think he's kind of around this discussion of, he was really good to start, really bad against this Chicago Bears team on Monday night, and kind of like, what is the actual evaluation from him? Do you take only his bad games? Do you take only his good games? Do you take in a composite of all of these things and fitting, some sort of range to what he could potentially provide? And I think doing that range approach and kind of understanding, given a good game from Tim Boyle or Josh Dobbs, like what can be the expectation for this Jets offense? And then given a bad performance, like where are they kind of at, and kind of basing your handicap around, I would say those two outcomes or those two performances is really kind of how I've tried to build it out. But again, kind of doing that from a quantitative nature is really difficult. I do think in some ways that's kind of where, simulation-based approach can come in, where you do have a quarterback and given his prior performance or given his replacement level performance, like what could be the expectation in a good game and a bad game. And I think that's kind of the way to evaluate it. But it is, I would say, a really difficult problem. I don't think any one person has necessarily landed on a publicly facing solution that has been, outperform the betting market in a lot of ways. But I do think there are definitely some edge cases and opportunities for bettors who maybe have an understanding of those range of outcomes and how they can potentially price that into their overall handicap, I would say.
Yeah, it certainly is a very interesting problem. Tim Boyle had a 33.3% success rate compared against Miami compared to an NFL average of about 42%, 2.9 yards per pass attempt. A guy who didn't really play at the collegiate level
Right.
at any, it didn't really perform. And I think that's quite a contrast to Dobbs, who, I think you could say was probably better than replacement level at Arizona
Right.
this year,
Yeah.
earned him the spot. And then it's interesting because Tim Boyle is the starter this weekend, and Joshua Dobbs is being evaluated by his head coach.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, I do think it's hard. I don't know. I mean, Tim Boyle must be doing something in practice that is allowing him to even be a
In the
backup
conversation.
quarterback
Yeah.
in the NFL. So, I mean, he's doing something right. I mean, two organizations have made him the backup, and that's not an easy thing to do. But
Right. That goes, I think that kind of goes back to like the barrier to entry thing. Like all of these guys are, at least in some ways, good enough to put out a decent performance in any one game sample, right? And
yeah,
judging them based on their worst performance is very much not how we should handicap them.
yeah,
But in some ways, judging them at their best performance is very much not how we should either. So kind of, marrying those two ideas together, it is kind of, like you said, a very difficult problem, but one that we probably need to do with at least somewhat, better accuracy in order to, I would say, kind of have an edge against the betting market.
excellent. Ben, I noticed you no longer have PFF in your Twitter profile, so just wanted to ask kind of where you are professionally and what the future holds for you.
Yeah, definitely. So it has been an interesting year. I did, quit with PFF, slightly before the NFL season. There was, I would say a number of different factors always play into those decisions. I'd been there for, a little under 3 years. Definitely felt like, the right time to leave. There was a lot of changes, that continue to kind of happen at PFF. So the opportunity to move on, I think, kind of presented itself. I did think doing something before the season started to make a lot of, sense from my own personal perspective. But yeah, I think, if people are interested overall in even like the PFF story, its beginnings and also kind of like current outlook and maybe even some projection into the future, I think Matthew Collar wrote a really good book, kind of highlighting a lot of that. There are some really key, I would say, contributors into that. But for me, it's interesting. I think it's, kind of a discussion that, you and I have had in previous settings, maybe not in a public facing setting, but like there's very much still this idea of like data and analytics and it constantly needing to be proved right. But if there's any sort of, I would say, like eye test fail that actually happens on the output that you have from any individual model or any overall overarching model process, like there's always going to be skepticism. And I think, working for a company that is, supposed to be really data driven and focused and those sorts of things, but maybe doesn't have the trust in a model based data science approach that they really should have, like you're going to have disagreements and you're going to, unfortunately have, products and things that don't necessarily live up to, what the expectation is, because I think there's, and I think it's something that's only going to continue to be challenged. But, very much, I think, the eye test is a really difficult thing to overcome. And when people have a, I would say a set idea of things from their own personal experience, and some of the data and metrics and modeling kind of goes against those things, there is this interesting, discussion or challenge that needs to happen. And for me, being on the data side and producing some of those models, like I want to be involved in with a company that kind of trusts the data. And when that doesn't happen, I think it's really difficult to, I would say, continue long-term in that sort of relationship. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, I think that's kind of like the fallout from that. And in a lot of ways, I think if you read, PFF's book in general, like those are some of the challenges that they're still kind of grappling with and struggling to really do, because there is so much, institutional knowledge, and in some ways kind of peeling both of those layers back and coming to some sort of agreement is just not something that I would say has really happened yet. So for me, that's a long-winded way of saying, to me, I want to trust the data and I want to work for a company that is willing to allow me to do that. And I very much think that I've, found that, with where I'm going to be starting at here relatively soon, smaller startup basically, but very much focused on like the football analytics side of things, preparing hopefully teams for the NFL draft, and also giving consumers like, a new way of evaluating not only like their fantasy teams, but also like their betting opportunities and those sorts of things, and really using data in a much more, defined way to really kind of drive decisions and really trusting that process, I would say. So I'm excited about the new opportunities. I am very fortunate to have worked at PFF, and I learned so much from them. And there's, a ton of quality people that I got to work with and are still working there. And I really think in so many ways, kind of like Matthew Collar highlighted in his book, like they very much, change the game from an analytics perspective, and very much, are and will continue to be kind of at the forefront of this analytic discussion that we continue to have.
Absolutely. I still use PFF grades in a lot of my analysis and a lot of the data, and was very pleased that all of a sudden all the college football data became available to me from whatever subscription I have based on the NFL. But Ben, before I let you go, I did want to just talk about the eye test. Every model fails the eye test at some point.
Yeah.
I think every weekend you're going to find a game in the NFL or college football where a model doesn't pass the eye test. So how do we, I guess, how do you square what you saw with just the fact that models are never perfect and always need improvement?
Yeah, I think it's a really good discussion. To give a little bit more background, so like my time at PFF, we were most recently, I would say, working on this type of like play-by-play simulation. I think I did talk about it, last time I was on the podcast, but it was essentially a way of like, kind of taking team inputs and player individual inputs and then simulating out on a per play basis what we expected to happen. And when we do that over, a big enough sample size, we could start to see things. So my wrapping up time at PFF, I was kind of evaluating the output of that particular, I don't want to call it one model, but it was basically like one process that essentially had, 10,000 simulations of every single game that was going to happen in the 2023 season. And my approach was, at a league-wide level or at a per game level, like how close are we to, the actual betting market and what they're projecting this out to be. And some of the output from it was like, I would say so much of the output from it was very close. And the one spot that I think, and obviously looking back on it now, it's even more interesting, but the one spot that the simulation seemed to be just lower from a league-wide perspective on was scoring. I think it wasn't down like a full touchdown from where the expectation would have been from the betting market, but it was within like, 5 to 6 points or something like that. And it was always on the downside. So if there was like a, 53 point total to start, week one of the NFL season, like we would have probably had that as like a 47 or a 48 point projection. And it was weird. And to be honest with you, I couldn't explain it that well either. So that's, I think, the reason why I didn't pass the eye test, because, passing yards were kind of holding constant, rushing yards, all these things were kind of holding constant. The one thing that seemed to be different was, sack rate was a little bit higher and turnovers were a little bit higher. And I think in some ways, scoring because of that was so much lower. And it's interesting me looking at it now because, it didn't pass the eye test then when we were trying to use it as a prediction basis and kind of comparing it to other prediction based metrics or other predictions that were already happening within the market. But if we look back at those results now, like in a lot of ways, they became true, right? And we have seen, I would say, scoring kind of fall off a cliff in the 2023 season. In a lot of ways, we're still trying to piece together why that's even happening now that it is happening. But scoring overall has dropped that by basically that entire touchdown thing. And I think in some ways, like to go back to the eye test question, like there is needs to evaluate the model. And I do think you need to compare it to what is actually happening. But there is probably like this cautious approach that when you're comparing something that's supposed to be used as a prediction and you don't actually have that prediction yet, it is really difficult to, not shift back and forth on what should actually be happening. And then you rely so much on your eye test. And I think the eye test can be good from when you have a big enough sample size, but when you're focused kind of like on your question, if you're focused on like, one individual game as an outlier, like That's just going to happen in a prediction-based setting. Like, you are going to see the outliers or the random performances or the things that, are in some ways impossible to predict from a model perspective. And focusing on that being more of an outlier as opposed to something that you want to anchor to, I think, is how you actually do end up making your model stronger and better long-term at those predictions, and understanding that there are always going to be edge cases, but that edge case is maybe not something that should fundamentally shift or sway your model, I would say.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing that, Ben. Really appreciate your time coming on the podcast. Please let everyone know where they can find all your good work.
Yeah, so if you can follow me on Twitter, Ben_R_Brown_. I had to add a ton of underscores. I apparently don't have a very I don't have a very unique name, unfortunately, is what I've continued to discover my entire life. But yeah, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I do a weekly article on Pinnacle, and I'm hoping to potentially have my own sounding board or podcast starting up here relatively soon. I would say maybe at the start of the new year, and hoping to have Ed come on as a guest at some point once it gets ramped up and going as well. But yeah, it'll be great, and I just think getting some more of like the public facing work out there, some of the evaluations and things that I've done, I think is going to be really interesting. So make sure you check out the Twitter space, and that'll lead to everything else that's here to come out, say, over the next month and beyond.
Absolutely. And I was able to find a bunch of your weekly write-up on Pinnacle from your Twitter, so I would highly recommend checking that out. Thanks again, Ben.
Thanks, Ed.